Yes, it did. Very good.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. So let me just jump right to it because we're a few minutes after 7.
Yes.
So for those of you who don't know me, good evening, everyone. My name is Judith Sidney. I am a GAN alumni parent of a class of 2020 and one of the co-founders of Tribe Talk. Along with the educators and staff at GAN Academy, I want to thank you and welcome you back to session 3 of our Israel 101 series. Before we get into the substance of the program, I just wanted to share a few of the details of the origin of this program series and the collaborators. Both GAN, which you know, and Tribe Talk, which is a nonprofit founded to empower young people to navigate the complexities of Jewish life, were both approached to co-host this series. This important program series has been made possible through the incredible generosity and loving memory of Walter and Naomi Chuknin by the Hartman, Kablotsky, and Ente families. We are so very grateful for their vision and partnership. Couple of quick housekeeping notes before I turn the Zoom room over to Jonathan and Yoni. Just please mute yourselves, but I want to encourage you to turn your speaker mode on if you'd like and keep your screens on. We'd love to see you and feel free to enjoy dinner, tea, coffee, what have you, but we'd love to see your beautiful faces. And I just want to also encourage you to put any Q&As into the chat. I do think that it's really helpful. We will be monitoring that. So please note that we are also recording tonight's session, and I really want to just encourage you all to just enjoy yourselves, take lots of notes, and Jonathan and Yoni, the Zoom room is all yours.
Thank you, Jude. Great to be back all together. And so the next housekeeping note is, if you would like access to tonight's handout, Yoni has just put it in the chat. You can click on that and follow along. As always, we will be sharing the slides as well, but we'd like for you to have it for after this session, or perhaps you want to scroll ahead, scroll behind to ask your questions, look back at any slides we showed tonight, and that is there for you. So tonight is session 3 of 4, and which we'll preview tonight, do a little bit of review of class 2 before moving on. And let's start with this picture. So Jude mentioned Tribe Talk's mission to help young people think about talking about Israel out in the world. And this picture is personal for me. So here I get to tell a little bit of an autobiographical story. September 13th, 1993. I was a junior at Princeton at the time, watching this handshake at the Student Center on campus. And you can see a beaming Bill Clinton, a widely grinning Yasser Arafat, and more of a grimacing, not so happy Yitzhak Rabin giving this handshake, which says a lot, and we'll unpack who those characters are, what this moment meant later in today's session, as well as tomorrow. But I remember watching this handshake and thinking as a 20-year-old at the time, I'm going to see the peace in the region that people have been praying for decades. How lucky am I to see that? And you say, typical naive college student, right? Thinking peace is going to come in his time. I want to bring you back to that moment for a minute about why I felt that way and how it ties a lot of themes of tonight. So again, that's September 1993. 4 years earlier, as a high school student, I saw the Berlin Wall fall, which people never imagined would happen in the midst of the Cold War. 2 years after that, just after Christmas, I saw Mikhail Gorbachev sign a piece of paper that the Soviet Union would no longer exist, the greatest enemy to the United States. Why wasn't I living at a time of great change, great miraculous wonders in the world of geopolitics? It was in the spirit in the air of the 80s and 90s. You even had Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history. It was going to be an unbelievable decade. Democracy was going to flourish, and all these articles in the 90s, democracy flourishing everywhere. We look back about 30 years after this handshake in a very different world, a very different space. But part of our job, the job of Yoni and for me in this series, is to restore to you the choices that people once made and the context too. Because it's important to know the ups and downs, the ways in which different leaders saw their own times, to look for, like we said in class 1, the rhymes of history. Where is it similar or different to our own time? So today's class is Today and the Future. Chronologically, we'll probably take the story from about the Six-Day War to the year 2000. We'll see what tonight gives us, which leaves the last class looking at the past 2 decades. And tonight's story is a lot of the optimistic sides of the story. There are definitely some trials and tribulations to be sure, Six-Day War, Yom Kippur War, but some of the high points. What led to peace with Egypt in the 1970s? What led to this handshake in 1993 and the thought of peace? And then hinting at why were those hopes not exactly realized? We'll more hint at tonight and get into more depth in our last session about the current reality. So just as a reminder where we've been, where we're going, class 1, Hatikva, the Hope, we looked at Herzl, early days of Zionism, Balfour Declaration. Last time, Hamatzav, the situation, a lot of focus on the Peel Commission, and we'll show you a slide of that in a moment, as well as 47 and 48, the establishment of the State of Israel, and how it sets up some of the debates to this day. So again, today's class 3, Ha'atid, Hayom V'Atid, today and the future, taking the story from the 60s. Again, not quite up to the present, but at least to around the year 2000 or so is our hope. And then for the last class, depending where we leave off, we'll take the story all the way to November 21st, 2022, wherever we are next week. Perhaps a new Israeli government forum to chat about. Where do things stand? Is that we'll take where's the conversation today is where we will conclude when we're together next week. A few images of last time. In the upper left, the Peel Commission, the first two-state solution plan you see in the orange, pink, and green. The British who realized in 1937 they didn't think they wanted this mandate, control over this land anymore. Could they partition into two states? Didn't come to fruition, but it planted the seed of an idea of a two-state solution, still in the vocabulary. Some say maybe no longer viable, maybe it is, but the idea of two-state solution goes back to 37. Then going down to the bottom of the wide landscape map of the actual plan of partition between a Jewish and Arab state, the vision of the UN in 1947. And we talked a little bit about its aftermath, both the Palestinian refugee crisis and the refugees who came to the state of Israel from throughout the Middle East. And then finally, the last map we'll look at again, is in the upper right from 1967. That's a May 1967 map. Neighboring Arab armies going to the borders, Israel fearing its own destruction on the eve of the Six-Day War, and we'll unpack that context again in just a moment. We'll talk about the lead up to the Six-Day War and its aftermath and its impact up to our own time. And again, these maps we looked at close to the end of last time. Just as a reminder, on the left, looking at the Sinai Peninsula and the Suez Canal, which you can see in the orange, the diagonally shaded orange on the left of the map on the left. Control of the Suez was so important. The British and the French had it once. Gamal Abdel Nasser, new leader of Egypt by the 1950s, says, no, we are now an independent country. We want the Suez Canal for ourselves. Threatening to Britain, threatening to France, and threatening to Israel for the way in which it could trade and interact with the larger world, leads to a 1956 campaign, which is an unusual moment in the Cold War. Both the United States and the Soviet Union were on the same side. They both backed Egypt and were critical and not backing either Israel, Britain, or France. It's a really key moment in the Cold War context, and it sets up a lot of the story of the Six-Day War a decade later because Israel got key military intelligence from it, but also it shows the contrast. Many people think the Eisenhower years were the low point of U.S.-Israel relations, that U.S. was very critical of Israel in this period, particularly because of this operation. Many in the State Department thought, why did Truman made it such a big mistake recognizing Israel in 48? We need oil from the Arab world. All these huge countries, we need their help and support. Why are we supporting this little country of Israel, who the State Department didn't think was going to survive its war of independence? But the story starts to turn a little bit in the Six-Day War, even more so by the Yom Kippur War, and some of that we'll talk about. And again, the map on the right is reminding you the broader context of so many independent countries in the world, particularly in Africa and Asia, that come to be independent from former European empires after World War II. And that's a key part of our story, not only for international politics, but also to put the Palestinian national movement in context, which we'll do a little bit later. So let's go right to 1967, the map we left with last time. It's May 1967, and this is a few weeks before the war. And one of the interesting things to note, one of the interesting factoids about history, Israel did not have television in 1967. So the US had it since the 50s, many countries in Europe, many in Egypt, surrounding Arab countries did. Israel didn't. David Ben-Gurion thought television is a bourgeois invention to get people to be capitalists and buy all kinds of products. He didn't want television at all. And some who've been to Israel know the intense radio culture of Israel to this day, listening to the news and music. TV comes in 1968, the year after the Six-Day War. Why is that important for our story? Most Israelis are getting their news from the radio, not through pictures. But what pictures can they see? They can see pictures of Egyptian television broadcasts, Gamal Abdel Nasser pounding day after day about driving the Jews into the sea. So you add that to this map of armies assembling, And Egypt's able to go into the Sinai Peninsula in the lower left because Egypt said, we want you. There were UN troops there since 1956, keeping the peace. Egypt says, get out of here. We don't want you to be in Sinai anymore. And those troops left not long after Nasser's orders. An early reminder and a sign of why Israel in more recent years has had such suspicion of the UN. Why did they let these peacekeepers go? Why did they listen to Nasser's orders? But you can see Egypt, Syrian, Saudi, Lebanese forces, and Jordanian, all aligned around Israel. And people are openly talking in some quarters about, would this be a second Holocaust? The destruction of Israel, mass graves being built, prepared for a mass slaughter in May of 1967. There was real fear in the minds of Israel and real shakiness in the government, so much that both sides of the political aisle, Levi Eshkol of the Labor Party was in power, but it's the first time Menachem Begin, a future prime minister, would come in a unity government just on the eve of the Six-Day War to deal with the impending crisis. Okay. But what's interesting is when we now have the declassified record, as nervous, and understandably so, as the public was, seeing these scenes, seeing the speeches, what's fascinating is just to see the CIA assessment. Now, just as a reminder, the State Department CIA said in 1948, oh, this Israel is never going to make it through the war. They're never going to survive. They underestimated their capabilities, which where Israel was quite successful in the 48 war against what the State Department thought would happen. In this case, the intelligence got it just about right in terms of what would happen. And just to look at the quote on the right, we concluded that if Israel preempted, they did the first strike, they could win clearly in a period of about 7 days. Six-Day War. We also estimated if they did not preempt and Israel attacked first, it would take somewhat longer, perhaps 10 to 14 days. Robert McNamara, same Secretary of Defense, famous, this is the Vietnam War era as well, just as an aside. We may talk about that context a little bit later. But again, so the U.S. had a good sense, had a lot of confidence in the Israeli military and its capabilities at the time, and almost really got it just about spot on. Because moment one of the war was a preemptive strike by Israel on the Egyptian Air Force, and that really sets the tone of the war that would follow. So again, just to name the rightful public fear and among Israeli leadership too, and American Jews watching this scene, and then behind the scenes, the sense of confidence of what Israel ultimately was able to accomplish. And we'll talk both about that, but also its consequences in the coming slides. So from a country that thought it was going to be destroyed, look at what this map shows. A country that increased its territory 3.5 times its size. The major gain being the Sinai Peninsula, you can see in the map on the left. The Gaza Strip in the northeast portion of where that Sinai Peninsula is, you're now seeing on the arrow. What the international community calls the West Bank, Jews call Judea and Samaria, and that'll be a key part of our story. Territories with Jewish history that were not part of the 48 war, but become part of the state of Israel afterwards. And finally, the Golan Heights next to Syria. All 4 gained as a result of the Six-Day War. Not part of forethought, this is Israel's plan. Step by step, that all unfolded, including Jerusalem returning to Jewish hands. And we'll talk about the consequences of that momentarily. So it's a miraculous victory, and it's called the Six-Day War. Many people think, because it lasted 6 days. But there's another interesting story behind it. Yitzhak Rabin, future prime minister, hero of the war, was given the honor of what should this war be called. Why did he want to call it the Six-Day War? To remind people of the 6 days of creation in Torah. A whole new world was being created, he argued, and that proves to be correct. I mean, it is a whole new world for Israel, from then until now, in a lot of the context that we understand. And it's in the midst of a Cold War, and there's an idea about a formula for land for peace, and we'll show you Resolution 242 in a moment, where Israel is hopeful, perhaps, and there's a big cabinet debate we'll show you as well, can we make a land for peace exchange with our neighbors? But the response that's given in the fall of 67 is the famous 3 no's. No peace, no recognition, no negotiation on the part of the Arab neighbors. At that moment, it doesn't seem like there is someone interested in negotiating for that peace. And we're going to unpack that context together as we continue. So again, more scenes of the joy and the highlight. Look at Life magazine. Look at the famous picture next to the Western Wall, the upper left of the 4 pictures on the right, of proudly coming back to Jerusalem. The song, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, was a hit song leading up to the war, and of course had new meaning once Jerusalem was retaken as part of the war. And this phrase, we were like dreamers. If you want to read more about it, about this whole story, Yossi Klein Halevi, wonderful author, writes for the Times of Israel, works at the Hartman Institute, wrote a wonderful book called Like Dreamers, which traces 7 soldiers who fought in the Six-Day War, but then who took very different political stances and paths afterwards. It's a wonderful telling of that time in modern Israel, and he called his book Like Dreamers. Hayinu kacholmim, just like the Psalm said before, grace after meals. And we were like dreamers coming back to our land after being in exile, but coming back to Jerusalem in this context. And look at the quote from Haaretz, still the newspaper today from June 867. The glory of the past age is no longer to be seen at a distance, but is from now on part of the new state. And its illuminations will irradiate the constructive enterprise of the Jewish society that is a link in the long chain of the history of the people in its country. Jerusalem is all ours. Rejoice and celebrate, O dweller in Jerusalem. Just the overwhelming joy, euphoria, one might say, about this war was felt. You can see that in the quote. You can see it in the magazine covers, in the sense of real strength. It's a high point in many ways in Israel's history. And it's in this era that a famous song is sung and performed, imagining, dreaming about peace. So we're going to play for you a little bit of that song, which has a vibe of the 1960s. Those who know, like the shows Hair, Age of Aquarius, and the like. So in a moment, Yomini is going to set up to have place a little bit of the song, and we have the lyrics here. And we want to, again, to give you a feel of the time among some. What would the post-67 Israel look like? What might peace look like? What were they hoping and aspiring for? This song, more than almost any historical artifact of the time, communicates that feeling and that message. So with that, we'll play a little bit of the song with the lyrics here, and then maybe we'll talk about it a little bit, and I'll open for some questions about what I've shared at 67 and what this song says to you. So a small taste of the longer song. So maybe let's put the lyrics just for a moment, and then we'll open up to thoughts and questions about this song. So think about the song, its tone, its message. Who's not coming back, right? In part, this is a song mourning for friends, comrades who've been lost in the war and going through memorial ceremony. So what are we going to do now? We've won a war, but we've also had a lot of personal loss. What might happen? And so this song is talking about that idea of we're not going to be able to bring our friends back. So what is it that we can hope for? and it's a song of peace, which will unpack what that means in a moment. Let me pause there, and yeah, let's just open up to the group. Thoughts or reflections on the song. We're also always want to pause. We do a lot of curriculum quickly, so any questions on anything I've said thus far? Lead up to 67, Six-Day War, the song. The floor is open for a moment for questions. And feel free to put them in the chat or use the hand raise function on Zoom, and we'll be happy to call on you. Okay. If not, again, we're happy to continue, but if there are questions, again, feel free to raise hand. You can put them in the chat. One other thing I'll say is people are thinking about the song. Many people recognize this song from a later period, from November 4th, 1995, tied back to the handshake, when Yitzhak Rabin, in a peace rally in Tel Aviv, sang this song with a big crowd once again. And when he was killed, when he was assassinated, the lyrics of this song were bloodstained with the bullet, the song for peace, in his the breast pocket of his coat. So how a song from post-67 with that dream of peace, and which many people felt was shattered by that night, and what happened November 1995, we'll come back to by the end of tonight. Interesting tie back to this song from 1968. I think many people know as well.
I don't have a question, but I just want to share that when I was a camper at Camp Yavne, we had to learn this song. We sang this song. I remember in the 70s.
Thank you. Yes, and certainly all over, and Camp Yavne alum myself, so certainly many of the summer camps had a long tradition of learning important Israeli songs like this one, other Zionist songs or songs tied to Eurovision, etc., as a way of connecting to the state. Yes, and that makes sense. This would be one that many would have learned.
Jonathan?
Please, Marcia.
I was just going to say, I mean, I've heard the song, of course, but I don't know who wrote it, and was it, I mean, like, was it written as a protest? Was it written, you know, was it written by people kind of like opposed to the government, you know?
Thank you.
So talk
Great
about
question. Yes. Let's go put the lyrics back up if we could. It's the right question, a little bit about its history and what it's saying. So Yoni, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to address Marcia's question. I'd love for you to chime in as well. Look at the chorus. Sing a song for peace. Don't whisper a prayer, a tefillah, a prayer. Sing a song for peace in a loud shout. One thing that's built into this song, and we're going to build this theme momentarily, is a secular religious division of thinking about what this war means. Singing, but not just praying for, right? And this peace coming, in a sense, from a group who are, they're relieved the war is over. They're sorry that they've lost their friends. And again, I think it is important. 68, think about the world in America, those who may know about that in 68, of the Vietnam War being something that was divisive there, and in a global context too. And Vietnam is important for the aftermath of the Six-Day War. On the one hand, is it fighting for freedom or democracy, or is it an unjust war that's being fought? Is the sacrifice worth it, or is it not worth being drafted or fighting to die? So clearly, there is a strong left political message in this particular song, which is saying, yeah, we are thinking about how can we make this all worth it? The sun to penetrate through the flowers, like again, you think of flower children, like of the 60s in America. It's not just a dream. We can make a new dream in reality. Think of the utopian sense in America that many people thought who were anti-war. So clearly an anti-war song, and thinking about the hopes for a new reality. And then we'll talk about some of that going forward. Let me see if Yoni wants to add something more to what I've said before we go on.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. One of the other sort of interesting historical notes about the song that makes it particularly interesting is that it was first publicly sung in 1968 by an ensemble of the IDF, of the Israeli army. That it was sung by the very army that for many people had caused this enormous celebration, and also for many people had caused them great anxiety, because we don't want to become a culture that is so steeped in war, steeped in fighting. And so it's just interesting to note that it would be the army that would be the first institution to sing this song. So that I think this, John, you put it beautifully, and I just wanted to add that. That's
right.
food for thought for particularly as we move forward and seeing what the Army will do, particularly in the areas that were taken by the IDF in 1967. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Yes, very important news, Ad. Thank you. So I just have one more slide, and then I'm going to pass the story to Yoni to flesh that out, which is, what did the UN say? What's the UN formula about land for peace? It goes back to this UN Resolution 242, passed after the war, which sets up the conditions. What is it that could create Middle East peace? And we're going to focus mostly on part one and a little bit on part two. So the deal is as follows. I'm first we'll read it in the English so you can see Roman numeral 1 and then the Roman numeral 2 below. The withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflicts. The formula is as follows. Israel conquered a lot of land, we saw on the map. If Israel withdraws some of its forces, and we'll talk about which territories and what in a minute, withdraw from those territories, what happens in exchange? Termination of all claims or states of belligerency and respect and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, integrity, and independence of every state in the area in their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries, free from threats or acts of force. Land withdrawn, exchange for peace and recognition of boundaries. Particularly important for Israel, but also recognizing all the neighboring countries as well. Land for peace. Now, one of the fun little facts about this story is to compare the French to the English. I'll first look at it grammatically, and I'll talk a little bit about the backstory behind it. So let's look at the English again. Withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflicts. Now the French. Retrait des forces armées israéliennes des territoires occupés lors de récents conflits. Retreat of Israeli army forces from the territories. Not territories, the territories. Now in part, this is grammatically how French works. From the territories. But that word the territories is very important because the could imply all. This only applies if Israel withdraws from all the territories it acquired, then it gets peace. But Israel in the US time, no. And in fact, they negotiate specifically what the English version would be. From territories, which could mean some, not necessarily all. That's up to the negotiating table. And that difference of that one little word, the, classic diplomatic ambiguity, each wanting to interpret the way in which they want, using the language version that they want, is so important to understanding this story, especially when we talk about Menachem Begin later and his making of peace with Egypt by withdrawing from the Sinai. And did he fulfill the promise or not? We're going to come back to this text in a little bit. But really to remember that little line, the word the. And we know Arthur Goldberg, UN ambassador, someone on his staff was a young Alan Dershowitz, and they together were part of the strategy to say, you know what, we need the English to read this way, to have that room for negotiation and not to be so absolute, is a fun other little fact of this story. So that's, again, the basis for peace and negotiation. And now we'll pass the baton over to Yoni to talk about another way to look at 67 and the newly territories acquired and how others saw what the war meant.
Thank you. Yeah. So as John pointed out, 1967 was a major turning point for so many reasons. Not the least of which is what would happen to this part of the land that was conquered by Israel in the Six-Day War, known by many names. Some call it the West Bank, some call it Yehuda and Shomron, Judea and Samaria. After the ancient kingdoms of in the Bible, in the biblical times, Judah was the southern kingdom and Samaria the northern. There are those who call it the occupied territories, the occupied West Bank. Whatever term you're going to use, we're going to use terms interchangeably. We are not taking a position on what it should be called. Our goal is to just to let everybody know what are the various terms that are used in reference to this piece of real estate right here. So immediately after the land, the West Bank is taken, after the war, discussions within the Israeli cabinet begin as to what should happen to it. Huge debate. Do we give it back? Just whole cloth? If so, who do we give it back to? Do we keep some of it and give some of it back? Do we sit tight and make decisions? There was all sorts of discussions. One of the major plans that gets landed on by many was put out by Yigal Allon, who was the labor secretary, the labor deputy prime minister, rather. So he's a high-ranking official in the ruling Labor Party, and he's also a general. So he knew his security arrangements, and he suggested that that the land of the West Bank be divided into portions. The valley, the Jordan Valley, right here, to be turned into a buffer state between Jordan and Israel, and they would have security settlements that we set up right here. There would be a passage right here that would allow the Arab citizens to travel back and forth to Jordan. But essentially, this land right here would be taken, or kept held by Israel, and this diagonally shaded land here would be ceded back to Jordan. So this would be annexed by Israel, and this would be ceded to Jordan. It doesn't ultimately end up that way, but that proposal seems to be gaining traction. We'll put that on hold for now. Give you some insight into some of the internal debate that goes on within the cabinet. We'll give you a few moments to read it. You have a justice minister, you have Menachem Begin, who is a minister without portfolio, and you have Zalman Aran, who's the education minister. So Yaakov Shapiro, as the justice minister, says, in a time of decolonization of the entire world, can we really consider controlling an area in which mainly Arabs live, and we control defense and foreign policy? Who's going to accept that? Every progressive person will say, look, this is why we call these people the torchbearers of imperialism and colonialism. They want to turn the West Bank, which is populated by Arabs, into a colony of the state of Israel. If we become a binational state, the Jews will become a minority, and then we are finished with the whole Zionist enterprise, and we'll be a ghetto here. Menachem Begin says, we'll be the ones, will we, meaning our government, be the ones to divide the land of Israel for the first time since the destruction of the temple? I admit, I'm a sentimentalist. It was sentiment that brought me here. And finally, Zalman Aran says, there we go. A state with 40% Arabs is not a Jewish state. It is the ultimate fifth column, the kiss of death in 20 or 30 years. So there is a complete lack of clarity within the Israeli cabinet as to what to do with the West Bank. I want to pause here, take comments or questions before we move forward, and we see what actually happens on the ground next. And I guess the question I would pose is, do any of these make sense to you or resonate with you?
I think some of them sound similar to current concerns, like the 40%, or it sounds familiar, even though it was so long ago.
Yeah. And it is truly remarkable for us to think or to know that the debate that we're having now, which we like to think, oh, we've only discovered these things now, the Israeli government knew from the start. This is not what we are debating now, what we are discussing now, were known to the government the moment they took that piece of land. Other thoughts? Marcia, yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, did they, was there any way to kind of find out what public opinion, what the people of the land wanted? Because, once they were in office, but once you have a big situation like this, I just don't know what their opportunities to figure that out were.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say two things. One is, in many ways, that's actually the story of what happens next. And I think that's number one. And I think number two, that the lack of decision by the Israeli government, which we're going to look at in a moment, that you're already seeing foreshadowed here in this debate, is because they really are having a hard time getting a sense of what it is that the public actually wants to do with the land. That there isn't a whole lot of clarity, and what the instructions from the people will look like is not clear. So we're gonna see what happens in that vacuum in a moment. So Marcia, I think you're actually raising a really important point. Yes.
Hi, Bob Kahn.
Yes.
Yeah, well, so it's the same conundrum as today. And, you know, the Israelis couldn't turn the land over to the Palestinians because back then, as today, they were dedicated to the destruction of the state of Israel. So, you know, I don't really see that as a colonial situation. In fact, when the Israelis ran an experiment of turning land over, remember the Gaza Strip, you know, what took place was, you know, maybe should not have been unanticipated. But in any case, it kind of demonstrated what turning over land to folks.
Yeah. By the way, I just want to be clear that Shapiro's line about in a time of decolonization, I don't think he's necessarily making the claim that we would be colonizers. He's saying that the world would see us as colonizers. That regardless, right? So regardless of what you know, what it actually was, he was certainly concerned, at least here, in what world opinion would be. But Bob, your point is certainly well taken. Well, moving forward, what ultimately ends up happening, for at least the time being, was that the Israeli army would retain control over the West Bank, and the Defense Department would become the government, the official government of the West Bank. And so they ultimately, the Defense Department would set the terms of security. They would set the terms really of everyday affairs, the judicial systems that go on within Israel, so the police, etc. And that remains to this day to actually be the state of affairs, where the Defense Department is in control of the West Bank. Now, as we know, because going back to 1993 and the Oslo Accords, that certain areas were turned over and there was local control in certain areas turned over to the Palestinians. But overall, the Defense Department is the governing force inside of the West Bank. Now, what would happen other than that was a big question. And this goes back to Marcia's question. What did the Israeli people want? Do they want to keep it? Do they want to give it back? Do they want to keep parts of it? Well, what we know is that another reason that the Six-Day War becomes such an important turning point in Israeli history is that the religious Zionist movement, who we mentioned last class, and I'll do a very quick review of who they were, asserts themselves as they had not asserted themselves before. So again, just to remind ourselves from our first two classes, the religious Zionist movement was largely a fringe movement on some level of religious Jews who also were Zionists. Remember, most religious Jews for most of Israel's history up until this point had believed that Israel was a secular state, and that as a secular state, it could not possibly represent the interests of religious Jews, and that for many Orthodox Jews, it was actually a sin to be committed to Zionism. Now, by 1948, that had changed for many religious Jews, and they composed a tefillah, a prayer for the state of Israel, in which they say that the state of Israel is the flowering of our redemption. Many religious Jews had actually decided that they would get on board with the state by making a deal with Ben-Gurion. That's called the status quo arrangement, in which they would support Zionism in exchange for control over religious affairs of the state. So that would mean determining who would get to marry, who would get to divorce, rules for Shabbat, rules for Kashrut, etc. But for the most part, the arrangement was, you can have the religious affairs, leave the governing of the state to us. And religious Zionists basically were willing to play along. The Six-Day War changed all of that. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, who was the founder of religious Zionism in the 1920s and 30s, you may remember he is the one who puts out pamphlets in London synagogues urging reticent Jews of London to support the Balfour Declaration, has died, and his son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, has taken over his legacy. He is now, the son now runs a small yeshiva network called Mossad HaRav Kook, the Yeshiva HaRav Kook, the yeshiva of the Rav, or Mossad HaRav. And he's got a small band of followers who form themselves into a group called Gush Emunim, the Block of the Faithful. And what they write in August of 1967, just after the Six-Day War and the conquering of the land, the IDF's victory in the Six-Day War placed the people and the state within a new and fateful period, they write. The whole of Eretz Yisrael is now in the hands of the Jewish people, and just as we are not allowed to give up the state of Israel, so we are ordered to keep what we received there from Eretz Yisrael. We are bound, they say, to be loyal to the entirety of the country for the sake of the people's past as well as its future, and no government in Israel is entitled to give up this entirety, which represents the inherent and inalienable right of our people from the beginnings of its history. I just want to re-stress this part of their manifesto. No government in Israel is entitled to give up this entirety. So just reminding ourselves again, here is what the founder of religious Zionism, Rav Kook, the elder Rav Kook, not the son, the elder Rav Kook, Abraham Isaac, had written back in the time of the Balfour Declaration: we demand full restitution from the land which has been robbed from us. The crime which cries into the heaven must be completely corrected. So you can see the roots of this going back to Rav Kook, but for him, the idea of keeping land like the West Bank was only a dream. So when they talked about the entirety of the land in 1967, what were they talking about? Well, to some degree, indeed, they were talking about this piece of land, the West Bank, but they also had in mind, many of them, the vision of Jabotinsky and the Revisionist Party, who said we need to revise the mandate so it's not just this orange period, but also the originally promised green piece of land that had been axed off in 1922 and given over to the Emirate of Transjordan, that this was part of the land of Israel also. So when they talk about the whole land, they're talking, yes, about this, but they're also talking about this as well. All right, now we're going to take us to the moment of the Six-Day War. Right before the war, here is the elder of Kook's son, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, and he gives what is probably in the lore of the religious Zionist community, the ultimate speech that still rings in many of their ears. So on the eve of the war, he gave a speech, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, in which he said the following: on the night when news of the United Nations decision in favor of the reestablishment of the state of Israel reached us, November 29th, we talked about that last week, 1947, when the people streamed into the streets to celebrate and rejoice, I could not go out and join in the jubilation. We showed you pictures of that last time, the dancing in the streets. I, he said, sat alone and silent. A burden lay upon me. I could not accept the fact that indeed they have, meaning who the they is in this case, he's actually referring in this case to Ben-Gurion and the Zionist leadership, who agreed with to go along with the UN partition plan. They have divided my land. Yes, where is our Hebron? Have we forgotten her? Where is our Shechem? Our Yericho? Where? Have we forgotten them? Have we the right to give up even one grain of the land of God? The speech in May of 1967, and 1 month later, all of these cities that he describes here, Hebron, Shechem, Yericho, would be in Israeli hands. So now we're going to go back to Marcia's question about what did the Israeli people want? It's unclear. And other than cabinet debates and the establishment of the Defense Department as the de facto de jure government of the West Bank, no other action by Israel really took place until Passover of 1968. On the eve of Passover of 1968, this ad, tiny little ad, appears in Israeli newspapers. Simply says, wanted, families or singles to resettle ancient city of Hebron. For details, contact Rabbi M. Levinger. Who was Rabbi M. Levinger? Rabbi M. Levinger was a disciple of Rav Kook. He had gone to the Mosad Rav Kook, the yeshiva of Rav Kook, and he was there the night that he gave that speech, "Where is my Hebron?" He gets a small group of like-minded followers to join him. He tells the government, the Israeli government and army, who's in charge of the West Bank, we just want to do a Seder in Hebron. Please just let us go into Hebron. We'll do a Seder, and then the night after Chag, the day after Chag is over, the first day of Chol HaMoed, we will leave. We promise. So they pack up their trucks with refrigerators and with ovens and with couches and with everything else that would look like you're moving in, but they say we have to have kosher for Pesach food. We're going to an area with no kosher, so we need these refrigerators and ovens. And they set up shop in a hotel. The first day after the Seder happens, the first day after Yom Tov, and they don't leave. And they say, well, we can't really go, just give us till after Pesach. And the government says, okay. After Pesach, they still don't leave. And they're still there. And they turn to the government and they say, we're not leaving. This is the home, Hebron, of the Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the burial place. And this, by the way, is the Parsha, the week of the Parsha, in which Abraham, actually, this is a famous Rashi that they went back and quoted. In the Parsha, where Sarah, Abraham's wife, Sarah dies, Abraham goes to Hebron to bury her, and the owner of the plot of land in Hebron offers it to Abraham for free. And Abraham says, no, I'm going to pay you for it. And Rashi, the famous medieval commentary, says that was the first real estate acquisition by Israelites, by Jews in the land, to ensure that the land would stay with them. And so this is the very first, says Levinger, our very first piece of land. This is the burial place of Sarah, of Abraham, of all of our foreparents. We are not leaving. This was the very first kingdom right here. This is the site, the excavation site of David, the first capital of David's kingdom was right here in Hebron. So that's here. And of course, in 1929, one of the first sites of Jewish defense, of violence by Arabs against Jews, where there was a massacre by Arabs of Jews, took place also in Hebron. So we have ancient, and we have biblical, we have ancient, and we have modern history right here in Hebron. The glory and the blood of Jews are here, and we are not leaving. And that sets off another round of internal debates. You get a sense of what goes on inside the cabinet. So, shortly after that, quote 1, the ministerial committee order reads, we authorize the defense minister to make the necessary arrangement to ensure the personal safety of the volunteers. They call them not settlers, they use the word volunteers on purpose. Volunteers in Hebron, including moving them from the Park Hotel where they were from Pesach to other lodgings. So the ministerial order says that. Levi Eshkol, who is the prime minister, is invited to the very first wedding that was to take place in Hebron. And people were looking to see what would he do, because if he doesn't go, he's not supporting the settlers. If he goes, he is. So what does he do? He sends the Katzovers, who are the couple that's getting married, sends them a telegram that reads in Hebrew, Odi Shama B'Arei Yehuda V'chutzot Yerushalayim, the famous song that's sung at a wedding, blessed be he who has kept us alive and preserved us to hear the voice of joy and happiness in the hills of Judea. Odi Shama B'Arei Yehuda, that we would hear the songs of joy in Judea. So that is a song that we sing at weddings in telegram form by the prime minister sent to the Katzovers getting married in Hebron. And finally, right as he's sending that telegram, Levi Eshkol writes, the settlers entered Hebron as visitors and presented all of us with a fait accompli. Turning that behavior, he writes, into a system will undermine the authority of the military government, if not the state itself. no Israeli citizen who cares about national security can agree to be the party to such a thing. So I want you all to read these quotes again, and I'm curious to hear what are your thoughts. These are all quotes from the highest ranking officials of the Israeli government responding to the Hebron settlers who are now refusing. Thoughts? What's going on inside the Israeli government?
A little bit of chaos.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, it seems like even individuals don't really know how to speak up for what they really believe in.
Say more what you mean by individuals not knowing what to.
Well, Levi,
Like Levi Eshkol, the
Yeah.
prime minister. So he is no individual. He's the guy running the show. Go
and
ahead, yeah.
complete contradiction, right? The two voices that he's one giving to the settlers and another to giving to the government.
Yep, saying we can't have this and saying to the settlers, Mazel Tov.
Yeah.
Yep. Bob, yes.
Well, as in everything having to do with the subject, another conundrum, right? On the one, it's inconsistent because on the one hand, they don't want to provoke the Arab population. On the other hand, imagine an Israeli government saying Jews can't live, in these areas, while Palestinians can live in Israel proper. Jews, these areas have to remain Judenrein, no Jews. So it's a dilemma.
Yep. Moreover, the Israeli government is really concerned about what would happen if they tried to go in and forcibly extricate Moshe Levinger and those who are now refusing to leave. What would that scene look like? What would that do to our government? And so again, coming back to Marcia, to your question, what did the people of Israel really want? It's unclear, and the Israeli government is acting like they're not sure themselves as to what we should do right now. And so what ends up happening is that Gush Emunim, that the people who are sure as to what they want will fill the void. And they do. And they set up shop, and the government basically decides, okay, we're not going to remove them. And in fact, the army will be there to protect them. And they continue to send more settlers to establish now a foothold in Hebron. So that was an experiment by Moshe Levinger that to this day has continued on, and Hebron is now one of the flashpoints of regular conflict between the settlers, the Levinger's disciples who continue to live there, and the Palestinians. And it is one of the most heavily guarded of all cities in the West Bank. As you can see here, there's all sorts of roads and that Palestinians are not allowed to go on, walls, etc. Curfews, times of day, times of year when people are allowed to be here, not allowed to be there. And it is a really, really complicated city to navigate. But that goes back to that Pesach of 1968.
Well, I was going to say it's a bad look to have Israelis fighting Israelis, especially, right after a war and stuff. And we saw that there was a bad look when the army forced people out of Gaza too. There was a lot of, it was upsetting to so many people.
Yep.
Just the optics. So the strategy worked.
Yeah, it absolutely did. Yep. And the strategy would continue shortly thereafter, where Moshe Levinger says, we have now gotten our foothold in Judah, in the southern area, Yehuda. Now we have to reclaim, it's time for the Jews to reclaim the northern kingdom of Shomron. And so we will now move into the area called Sebastia. They find an abandoned train station. It's right near Shechem. In the northern, Shechem was the northern kingdom. of the Israelite biblical period, and they set up shop in Shechem. And they go through the same process again, with the government going back and forth. Will we pull them out? Will we not pull them out? At one point, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, the great rabbi, their spiritual leader, goes up to one of the hills in Shechem, where the army was poised possibly to pull him out, and he rips open his kapata, the black robe that Hasidim often wear, and he pulls it open, and he says, if the army wants to shoot me, they can go ahead and shoot me. So you have this dramatic showdown, and in many ways, it's actually settled, and this is one of the surprising parts of the story. When Defense Minister Shimon Peres, who, as John was telling us earlier, was central to the Oslo Accords and in many ways becomes more synonymous with peace than anybody else, Defense Minister Shimon Peres told the Knesset that he knows of no principle, we're reading right here, that prevented the right of Jews to settle in the Judea and Samaria regions. And so when Defense Minister Shimon Peres says it's okay, the government says, okay, so you can stay here in Shechem, or right outside Shechem in Sebastia. And this is the scene that takes place after the Israeli government officially recognized the settlers staying there. This is Moshe Levinger. This is another one of the disciples of Rav Kook, is Hanan Porat. And clearly, this is the celebration. And Rav Kook, Tzvi Yehuda Kook, talked about this is the celebration that we were not able to have in 1947. In 1975, though, we are now celebrating finally the way we should. And so in the vacuum of the Israeli government refusing to actually decide what should happen to the West Bank, religious Zionists filled the void. And they have a they have a protector, and they have a high-ranking government official, Menachem Begin, who will always be there for them, who was, going back to, we saw earlier the maps of the revisionists, he is Jabotinsky's #1 student, Menachem Begin. And so whenever the religious Zionists were in Hebron or in Sebastia asserting themselves, Begin was right behind them. The partition, he said, the partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. Eretz Yisrael will be restored to the people, all of it, and forever. That's what he said back in 1947. And later on in 1967, he writes, says that Israel will not transfer Judea and Samaria and the Gaza district to any foreign sovereign authority because of the historic right of our nation to this land and the needs of our national security, which demand a capability to defend our state and the lives of our citizens. We're going to come back to Menachem Begin in a few moments. Before we do, we're now going to transition over to what happens between 1967 and 1977, a fateful 10-year period. I want to just pause before we do. Are there any questions, observations before we shift over to a related but new topic? Okay. The status of the West Bank and the settlers, the Jewish relationship to the West Bank and the settlers who are there will be a major part of our story as we move forward, and particularly as we look at Oslo in 1993. But for now, we're going to return to the Israeli and Arab state conflict, which had in many ways climaxed in 1967 with the Six-Day War. So, returning to that story, in 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt, and in many ways the anchor of what had been called the Pan-Arab movement, that he was going to galvanize the Arab states together into a single vision of Arab solidarity and Arab power in the region. And in many ways, the Six-Day War was going to be the climax of that Pan-Arab movement. Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1970 died. And he is taken over, the presidency is taken over by Anwar Sadat. Anwar Sadat recognized that war with Israel was not an answer. And that the Arab states, no matter how much support, and they had gotten support from Moscow, military, training, etc., was not going to be enough to destroy Israel. And so Anwar Sadat decides that his path forward is going to have to be a face-saving peace with Israel. And so he turns to the new prime minister of Israel, took over after Levi Eshkol, Golda Meir. And Sadat, through the UN and through other emissaries, tries to get Meir to make peace. It would have entailed likely giving up most of the Sinai Desert, the Sinai Peninsula here, and Golda Meir won't do it, and she ignores Sadat.
Oh, Yoni, you still there?
Oh, did I freeze? Shoot.
I think he froze, Jonathan.
Yeah, I'll quickly text him and I'll pick up the story. Give me one
Am
moment.
I back?
Right. So as Yoni was saying, yeah, it would have given up big concessions. So Israel at the time was not interested in that negotiation taking place between the parties, and tried through the Nixon administration and others to do so. So one theory, and historians have looked at, is what would it take to get Israel to the negotiating table? Hang on, let me. Oh, you're back?
I'm back. Sorry about that.
All right.
Hopefully that will not happen again.
Yep.
Go ahead. Am I screen sharing again?
You're screen sharing again, yeah, and I just kind of filled the story leading up to Yom Kippur, just while you were away.
Yes. Okay. So why don't you just finish that thought? So, because I didn't hear what you said, so I don't know where to pick up. Yeah.
Sure. So part of the calculation, what would it take to bring all the parties of the world back to focus on this issue of negotiation, but as well as, again, the restoring of a sense of dishonor from the Arab world? That's part of the background of what the Yom Kippur War was all about. And yes, picking a sacred day, a surprise attack, just as Israel, its preemptive strike in 67, attacking in 73, and thinking with victory and might and strength might strengthen the position of Egypt, but ultimately in a negotiation with Israel. Now, what's also important to name here is the role of the US, which had really stayed out of the 67 war. Lyndon Johnson was thinking about Vietnam. He did not want to be in the middle, even though we know from stories, the red phone set up after the Cuban Missile Crisis between Washington and Moscow. People say the first time it was really used was in the Six-Day War. Was that going to spill over to the Cold War and be a larger regional conflict? But 73 is a different moment. As Israel's losing the war, Richard Nixon gave critical military aid to Israel to bounce back in that war. And a wonderful story of a former colleague of Yoni and I, again, tell the story about being in Jerusalem in 1974. Height of Watergate, when Nixon was hated by many in America and booed. He cheered vociferously by people in the streets of Jerusalem because of the role that he played in saving Israel in the Six-Day War from that military aid. And that really shifts the U.S. role being involved in the region. Now, so one more thought, then pass it back to Yoni. What Sadat calculated and realized too is ultimately he wanted a better relationship with the United States. He wanted economic prosperity for his country. And that's part what motivates him to be on the path to peace. With that, I'll pass it back.
Yeah. So just to pick the story right out there, for in many ways, the real mover and shaker from the American perspective is Henry Kissinger, who sees Israel as America's arm of the Cold War against the Arab bloc, which had in many ways become the Soviet arm. Egypt had been supplied and trained by the Soviet Union. And by the way, one of the things that caught Israel off guard was how well supplied and well trained they were. They did much better, the Arab armies, particularly Egypt, in the Yom Kippur War. And Kissinger believed that this was the opportunity to really strengthen their hold in the Middle East. And he also hoped that maybe, and we'll see what happens after the war, he could actually cajole Egypt away from the Soviet Union. But that Cold War of peace actually also led to one of the most terrifying moments in the entire Cold War. Basically, what happens as the war progresses is that Egypt, so I'll actually back up for 1 second. Egypt's goal again had not been to conquer all of Israel. Their goal was really to shake Israel into negotiations. And so they went about as far as this, the Egyptian army, successfully, and they stopped. Syria went this far and they turned to Egypt and they said, we need you to keep going. And Sadat said, no, we don't have air cover if we go further. And Syria said, well, if you don't go further, we're going to have to fight Israel by ourselves, because the Israeli army was able to turn around and fight Syria by themselves. And that's what that, and the combination of that and American arms in many ways, is what picks Israel up and allows them to go on the offensive. And they start pushing back against the Syrians. They start pushing back against the Egyptians, and in fact, actually were darn near Cairo. And they were now entangled. And at this point, Kissinger says, enough. We have what we need to negotiate. And if you go further, you might mess things up. So we need you to stop. And they won't stop. And Moscow says, fine. If the Americans won't do it, we will send our troops in to get the Israelis to stop. And at that point, the Americans are terrified, because it looks like you're now going to have Soviet troops on the ground, and what are the Americans going to do? And many people were terrified at this point that World War III is going to break out. They managed to calm everybody down and to get a ceasefire on the ground. Now, they're unable to disentangle the troops, and that actually won't happen for a long, long time. But at that point, they got a truce on the ground and they can begin discussions. They finally manage in what's called Sinai II in 1975 to agree to a pullback of the troops. And at that point, Sadat goes back on the trail again to try to get the Israeli government to agree to negotiations. By this point, the Israelis were in a very different frame of mind. This picture right here in many ways symbolized what Israelis believed that happened in the Yom Kippur War. That even though, yes, the Israelis had won, in many ways had gone on the offensive, that the Yom Kippur War was a failure of our government. It was not just a failure of our military to win in 6 days, but it was really, in many ways, when the blame gets put on the army, it was really a failure of our political leadership, because they were completely caught unawares. And they let this surprise attack happen. How could this possibly have gone down? What had gone on? And this picture of the Israeli tanks stuck in the mud, which was actually true for much of the war, very rainy season in October, became an actual symbol and in many ways a metaphor for what had happened. Sadat then goes back on the offensive to try to get Israel to pay attention. And in 1977, he gives a speech to the Egyptian parliament, in which he says, I will go, even if it means to Jerusalem, to make peace. And the question is, what would happen at that point? What happens at that point is that Menachem Begin has been elected prime minister in a land earthquake of an election. Menachem Begin, who's right here, had been a revisionist, the revisionist idol number one, and in many ways was seen as, Ergun. He was a terrorist. He was too right-wing. He was too crazy. He becomes the prime minister in 1977. In many ways, the Israelis' response to their lack of faith in the labor government. And of all the people to say to Anwar Sadat, you know what, you want to come to Jerusalem? Come to Jerusalem. Begin would have been the least likely person in anybody's imagination to invite Anwar Sadat to come to Israel. And yet in 1977, that is exactly what he did. And in one of the most remarkable scenes of Israeli history, right here, Anwar Sadat deplanes from an Egyptian airliner and shakes hands with Menachem Begin. After that, the president of Egypt gives a speech in the Israeli Knesset. So I pause and just reflect on what that must have been like to be there in that moment. After everything, after the wars in 1948, 1956, 1967, for the Egyptian president to be standing in the Israeli parliament, saying the following words, for Israelis was unimaginable. I come to you, he says, I come to you today on solid ground to shape a new life, to establish peace. We all on this land, the land of God, we all, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, worship God and no one but God. God's teachings and commandments are love, sincerity, purity, and peace. I do not blame all those who received my decision when I announced it to the entire world before the Egyptian People's Assembly with surprise and amazement. Some, gripped by the violent surprise, believed that my decision was no more than verbal juggling to cater for world public opinion. Others still interpreted it as political tactics to camouflage my intention of launching a new war. Many people said that that's what was happening. I would go as far as to tell you that one of my aides at the presidential office contacted me at a late hour following my return home from the People's Assembly and sounded worries. He asked me, Mr. President, what would be our reaction if Israel should actually extend an invitation to you? I replied calmly, I will accept it immediately. I've declared that I will go to the end of the world. I will go to Israel, for I want to put before the people of Israel all the facts. It's a remarkable moment. And it leads to one of the most important negotiations in diplomatic history in Camp David, right outside of Washington, a rustic retreat where Jimmy Carter negotiated an incredibly complicated set of deals between Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. It's a really, really complicated deal because from the beginning, Anwar Sadat had said that he was not going to make a deal with Israel that did not include peace with the Palestinians. But days went by and any deal that was going to be worked out seemed impossible. What that deal for the Palestinians was ultimately going to look like was not negotiable as far as Begin and others were concerned. And shortly after that, the Palestinian peace gets taken off the table. Nevertheless, the deal ultimately that is between Sadat and Begin is still a remarkable moment. And ultimately, the deal that is struck between Israel and Egypt includes the peace between the two countries and the two-stage removal of the Israeli army from the Sinai Peninsula, which was, by the way, even more than Sadat had originally wanted in the beginning when he was trying to get Golda Meir to pay attention. All the Sinai, which would also include a settlement called Yamit. And we'll talk about Yamit later. That was a Jewish settlement in the Sinai that was evacuated by, of all people, Menachem Begin, the person who in 1947 said, "We will never, ever give back land, particularly land that is lived on by Jews." To this day, the peace accord is insured by America by loan guarantees by the American government to both Israel and to Egypt in the form of $3 billion. And that is America's commitment to ensuring that the peace deal between Egypt and Israel is maintained. And with that peace deal, the Pan-Arab movement officially ended and would open up a new front in Israel's relationship, both with the Arab world and also with the Palestinians back home. And to tell us a bit more of that story, John is going to take us from 77 forward.
Okay. So we just have under 10 minutes together. And what I'd like to do is set the scene of the story from this time up to about the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s and see where we finish, and then we will pick up that story, bring it to the present in our last session together next week. On this timeline, you see a lot of the key moments of the story, some of which we've talked about, 48, 66, 67, those in the upper line. We only gloss over, didn't quite mention, let's go back again to 64, the creation of the PLO, 3 years before the Six-Day War. And in the aftermath of the Six-Day War and the defeat of the Arab armies, there was a sense among Palestinians to turn more and more to their own leadership when it came to thinking about their destiny. They felt disappointed that Arab leaders have not realized their ideas of having a home of their own, of, in some cases, the destruction of Israel, so they could have their home of their own. And they were inspired by the decolonization movements happening at the time in the 1960s. In Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh, Cuba, a Fidel Castro, a Che Guevara, and others. And some which involved violent resistance in the name of fighting for their independence. And that's a story of the 60s, the 70s, and beyond, of this question: would violent means achieve their ends, or would they take a different path? And as Yoni mentioned, in this peace process with Egypt, Sadat had the intentions to secure through negotiation autonomy, but was unsuccessful in doing so. And so this is an interesting kind of turning point moment for the Palestinian movement, in which a lot of the memories of those of the 70s and beyond are, again, violent resistance from Lebanon, from Jordan, from elsewhere, a number of stories through the 70s in terms of fighting for independence. But Camp David in Israel launches the Shalom Achshav, the Peace Now movement. Maybe peace starts with Egypt and it extends to others. The last item on this timeline, and then we'll start to transition toward the 80s and 90s, important for the broader regional context, is the revolution in Iran. From 1953 to 1979, the Shah ruled Iran, close to the United States, friends with Israel, a more secular orientated society. But when that revolution happens, puts in power the government we see to this day, it's a sign of a trend that had been growing in the 70s throughout the Middle East, moving away from secular leadership to more religious leadership. And that's a key contextual part of our story, as we'll see in the coming slides. So again, now a few slides on just setting up the story for our last 5 minutes together and next time. And I'm taking us right to the present. This will be one of the last slides we'll show you, and then tie it to a few moments of the 80s and 90s. If you want another book, people always ask after our classes, what's a good book to read to understand both the history, where the story takes us today? This is one of the best-selling books and most read books among the Israeli leadership class of the state, as well as others in the world, called Catch 67. Now, of course, Catch 67 is play off of the famous Joseph Heller novel, Catch 22, damned if you do, damned if you don't. And Bob has done a nice job talking about these conundrums and dilemmas with us tonight. And that Michael Goodman has a similar thesis at play about what is it that's made Israeli politics stuck since 1967, and how has the language shaped the debates going forward. On the left side of the column, you can see the argument why Israel must leave the West Bank, some, most, all of it. And on the right, it says why they have to stay in Judea and Samaria. And again, notice our use of language here. As Yoni said, language tells you a lot. On the left, it's the West Bank. That's the international name, West Bank of the Jordan River. On the right, we use the name Judea and Samaria because more on the right associate the historical ties. So the story really since of the past half century is this sort of debate between these two sides. On the left, the sense, let's keep going. We have to leave the West Bank because of the moral arguments we saw in the cabinet debate earlier, going back to the 60s, of the international community, somewhat internal to Israel. What would happen demographically to a Jewish state over time, the costs of security, and again, international disapproval of the project. Versus the right, it says, there's no way we can leave. And Yoni laid out the story beautifully in the case, right? That we have deep historic ties and ownership here. We have to stay religiously. History happened here. We actually, when we know many settlements are there for positive economic reasons, to make suburban Jerusalem and Tel Aviv more affordable. It's a major motivation for people to stay, and we have to maintain Israel's security. And what Goodman shows effectively is that At certain moments of history, Israelis believe both things at the same time, which seems contradictory. We got to leave, but we can't leave. How do we do it? And therefore, the stuckness that's part of our story. Now, he has a thesis about shrinking the conflict. So, are there things that can be done in the meantime to lessen the tension? I'm just going to say that word, that concept, and we'll unpack what it means more in our class next time. For our last 2 minutes, I'll show you about 1 or 2 more slides, and then we will conclude for tonight. Another timeline, and let's jump right towards the end. So I mentioned that, so look at the 1979 revolution, a war in Iraq, between Iran and Iraq, a Sunni and Shia war between a secular Iraq, a religious Iran, shaped the entire Middle East and much of the region and consumed, and the United States playing a role in that as well. But also in 1982, a civil war in Lebanon, in part sparked by the PLO fighting from southern Lebanon into northern Israel, still a place of conflict to this day. Israel successfully chasing the PLO out of Lebanon to Tunis, Tunisia, where they remained for some time, but then getting caught in a war, which some people compare to Israel's Vietnam War, a real quagmire. They accomplished that goal, but what's the end game? How do we get out of this war? It lasts all the way to the year 2000, which we'll touch on next time. But the last one I want to touch on briefly, and then look at one more map before we close, is 1987, the first Intifada, 20 years after the Six-Day War, a whole generation since that war, in part sparked by economic recession and being under Israeli military rule for 20 years. What would it mean for younger Palestinians? And initially sparked by a traffic accident in Gaza, which Palestinians were convinced was an intentional killing by an Israeli military convoy of 4 Palestinians, was the initial spark that led to the Intifada in 1987. But the enduring image is like the one you see on your screen. For most of the international community, what was the Intifada? Again, an image, pictures 1,000 words. A young person throwing a stone, young boy throwing a stone against a giant tank. And some around this room may remember the scenes 2 years later of Tiananmen Square in China, a person against a tank. The end of the Cold War shaped a certain story. Israel, in the eyes of some of the world, once seen as the David against the Goliath of many Arab countries, the media narrative really changes. And it changes with CNN being created in 1981, and images like this being replayed over and over. You didn't read the New York Times story, but this was the image you saw. And that changes the nature and the game of the calculation for Israel and for Israeli leadership in this context. Let's just show one more picture, Yoni, and then we'll wrap. So Yitzhak Rabin, hero of 67, first-time prime minister in some of those negotiations Yoni referenced over the Sinai withdrawal in the mid-1970s, comes back to the premiership in 1992. He was in charge of the military crackdown in the beginning of that Intifada. We have to break their bones, he was quoted as saying. But then he imagines peace. In 1990, he runs on, this is unsustainable for us. We have to think about a different path, a different way, in the context of the end of a Cold War, where I began our story of me being a junior at Princeton, led to a map that looks like this, and a map that still shapes the world as we know it. Of A, B, and C, and could there be a two-state solution? Well, many of us know kind of all the frustrations of that realization, what makes that not possible to our day. And we're going to leave that cliffhanger for next time. So what is it about this map? How is it created? What's happened over the past now almost 30 years? And how does it set up the conversation as we know it today? So with that, we'll pause. As usual, happy if there's a question or two in the chat, but this is our formal end, so if you need to leave, that's fine, but we're happy to take any questions or thoughts you have for a moment or two before we see you next time.
I'm curious as to the map, the dating on that map that you just showed us, Jonathan.
Sure.
What's the timing on that?
Yes. So this is part, and we will be sure to really go in depth because
No, I understand. Yeah.
Yes, but this is kind of reflected around the year 2000 or so, because it's showing you areas A, B, and C. Those categories are created between 1993 and 1995, and imagining what the map would look like. Now, because you can see areas like Gaza today, Israel is disengaged, no longer has any presence there. Whereas on this map, you see the little sliver of white shows Israeli presence. So this is before the 2005 Gaza disengagement. But a lot of the rest is really reflecting an A, B, and C map, where the A represents the big Palestinian cities, Jenin, Tulkarm, Nablus, Shechem, Ramla, and so on. B are almost the villages, almost think like mini suburbs that surround those cities. And C represents areas under for military control of Israel. And the white, the area C, 60% of the land, but all Jewish settlements are there. Versus the Palestinians, between A and B is only 40% of the land, but over 90% of Palestinians live in areas A and B. So it's a real, so C is really the contested, thought about area, what's going to happen to that. And again, we'll talk more about that next time. So this map both reflects an earlier time, but also some current realities that shape our understanding of this region, even to today.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, as you could, any other questions before we wrap? Because I know we're a few minutes over. Well, save them for next time if you like. I just want to thank you all. And just as you can tell, I always learn listening to Jonathan and Yoni. So thank you for joining us for session 3. I'm super excited that we still have one more to go. Hopefully you'll join us all for next week. And I really just want to thank Seth at GAN, who's really helped coordinate all the details. Seth Finkel, who sadly is just recovering from COVID, but feeling much better and couldn't join us tonight. But again, I really want to thank you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you next week. And I wish you all a wonderful evening.